So thank you very much for everyone that came tonight. So we are going to engage in a discussion with Venus and Abosede. So for a reminder, Venus is a clinical researcher, and Abosede is a professor, associate professor in history and African studies. So I think that both of your perspectives will really make for a beautiful and insightful conversation. So I thought that maybe we could start talking about the film by looking at what's the center of it, which is the mother and daughter dynamic and relationship. Um, so I think that personally, watching the film, I was really drawn to Maria, the daughter. We have Amina, the mother, Maria, the daughter. Maybe because I'm closer in age to the daughter, and she's facing such a difficult situation and has to make a choice that is very powerful, and she's breaking these cycles. Um, and so I thought it was very striking that the film really focuses on the mother's perspective and the mother's journey within the film. So I wanted to ask you, Abosede, about that and about sort of this representation of a mother and daughter dynamic that is shown as somewhat positive, or there's an evolution towards something that is positive, and maybe why that would stick out to you. What do you think that is? And essentially, yes, looking at how these dynamics are reflective of a larger picture when it comes to African cinema and representation of motherhood, narratives of motherhood, how we look at these traditional norms and if they're challenged or enforced in that sense.
That's a good question. I think one of the last scenes where Amina and Fanta are together, and they're both bonding around the fact that they've both saved their daughters, right? So this is all about like mothers saving their daughters, and that's like part of the sacred bond too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very like heroic portrait of, the mother is a kind of a lioness, kind of a very fierce mother, like fiercely protective, and that theme of protection comes up earlier in the film. And she says, "We don't need your protection, or we don't need protection." So, but they are the protectors. And so I thought that was really powerful. Um, I mean, I think that in a lot of, I mostly work in West Africa, and a lot of, uh, let's say West African cultures and Nigerian cultures, there are all these, and like anywhere in the world, there's like the fetish of the mother, right? There's you know, there are all these tropes about mothers. Mothers are never, necessarily complex figures. They're always just like one thing or another, right? And I think I think in a lot of West African cultures that I'm familiar with, anyway, motherhood is a very kind of valorized um, social status to attain, and so it's associated with a lot of power, especially power over children, and it's a one of the statuses of femininity. And so it's one that, that I think is very empowering, and you definitely see that version, that kind of ideal of the mother as a power figure, like in this film. So, yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to also ask you, Venus, what you maybe thought of the mother's journey from more of a mental health perspective, and how you really come to these two women are brought together by such a difficult situation.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that, my focus and my research is really on, the transition to motherhood that occurs. It can occur anywhere from preconception to pregnancy to postpartum. And generally what we see is that there's this whole concept of the motherhood constellation, which was developed by Daniel Stern, who's a psychoanalyst. And it's basically like, when someone becomes a mother, they think of their children first, and then they think of everything else. And so, this is something that every single one of my patients has told me. This is something that, we every time we do research on mothers, this is what they tell us. And even as I sit here, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, how's my kid? I wonder if she's okay, right? And so this is just kind of a natural thing that emerges for mothers. And so I wouldn't expect Amina to do anything less than that. Initially, when she gets so angry with Maria, like the anger that she shows her, I don't think that's anger because how could you get yourself pregnant? I think it's more this like mother going, oh shit, now I have to like do something about this. Now I have to fix this now because I need you to be okay. So I think the bond, like her, Amina's role as a mother is her daughter first and then everything else. And we know that through just knowing that she's a single mother, and there's so much stigma in her community about in regards to that. And so I think mental health, from a mental health perspective, I think that's the thing, right? The child comes first.
Right. Yeah, there's this big theme of sort of breaking cycles as well in the movie that I thought were very striking.
For sure. I mean, the breaking this. I mean, that's the thing that we see, that Amina's in this position where she, was shunned by her family. The circumstances around that I don't think are very clear, but there could be a potential of her daughter going through the same thing and being shunned, and but it's through this struggle that she's able to really open up that door of opportunity for her. And I think that motivation plays a really big role in that, and trying to change the situation so that she doesn't feel disconnected from society.
What's interesting is I think that in that scene when she does talk about shame herself, she's like, "Aren't you ashamed?"
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the mother's like caring about her. I mean, I agree with you that
Yeah.
there is a care there,
Yeah.
but I think there's also a lot of concern about respectability and her daughter's
Oh, that's
future.
the underlying, I think, the underlying piece of it, right? Because societally, what are we going to do,
Yeah.
right? Like how are people going to see us? What are people going to think? But I think that anger that emerges isn't rooted in shame. I think it's more rooted in this kind of, why is this happening? Now I have to fix it.
Mm.
That-
Well, I think you think that. I think it's rooted in
That's
shame, but then
fine.
I think that she changes.
I work with
I
a lot
think
of mothers, and like sometimes when their anger like emerges, I'm like, who are you really angry at? Like, are you angry at your kid right now, or are
right,
you angry at the fact that And generally, what emerges is it's not the child; it's
right,
that I had this expectation that you would be this, and
right,
now you've made this mistake, right? She doesn't know why Maria's pregnant, but she's
right,
this thing has happened,
right.
and
This thing has happened that's not like it's a shameful and a bad thing because of the social
social societal.
yeah, because of the social structures surrounding it, right?
Yeah,
The school is going to kick you out. Like
yeah,
if you're pregnant, you cannot think a thought and you cannot like learn anything at
yes,
the same time.
yeah,
And and her family kicked her out. Like if you're pregnant, you cannot be a daughter.
yeah.
You can only. So like the event itself, it's a, certainly the circumstances by which it happened are atrocious and very horrible. But the event itself is not inherently horrible. Like it's made so right by
Yeah.
a social context um, that requires certain things
Yeah.
of teenage girls and students and um, respectable people.
Yes.
I think also one central theme of the film is sort of how when women are put in this sort of repressive and restrictive environment, how do we survive and how do we create these sort of networks that go beyond the mother and daughter relationship? So in the film, we see a lot of this hidden network of women helping each other, and there's a lot of coded language that's used there. So I wanted maybe to bring this up and talk about the implication that comes with having to create these counter communities, and not just as a mean of resistance, but also as a means of survival. So maybe Venus, I could ask you if you had any thoughts about this sort of coded resistance that exists within women, especially when it comes to access to healthcare and medical care.
Yeah, framed like that, I was thinking about it in a different way, but framed within healthcare, I think it's a little bit different. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about the role that Islam plays within, like, reproductive health and reproductive well-being, and I think, one of the things that emerged from our earlier discussion is that these women get it right. Like the Islam piece, the women get it right. And I think it's a lot of the kind of patriarchal structures that really get in the way of Islam being, you know, seen in the way that it should. So the connection that these women have, the way that they support each other, excuse me, the way they support each other is something that is rooted in Islam. And there are whole groups of women scholars that exist all throughout the Muslim world. And because of the kind of ongoing wars, what we're getting is these folks coming into the United States and opening up access to those of us who live here, which is amazing because I've gotten access to so many female, Muslim scholars, which is not something that, I typically had access to. So I think that, you know, there is, there's this kind of notion of these things being out in the fringes, and we don't want women to kind of show, kind of their power, but they do have power, and they do have, these rights, and they do, genital mutilation, genital cutting is not something that's rooted in Islam. It's absolutely not. But the thing is, the understanding is that it is, and it's so all of a sudden, in order for you to be pure and for you to be, virginal or whatever it is that is the male kind of ideal of femininity, that is what gets kind of promoted. And so now these women have come to this place where it's like, whoa, we don't want this anymore. There's no justification for this. And so now all of a sudden they have this beautiful little trick that they do that's quite lovely and beautiful to kind of prevent that from happening and hurting these girls.
Right. Yeah, I think that this idea of a gap between what the lived experiences of women and the perceived restriction that's put by religion is a very interesting also aspect of the film in that sense. But I'm very
The
interested to know also.
healthcare piece. I
Sorry?
forgot about the healthcare piece.
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
It's okay because yeah, I was gonna ask about your other perspective, but I think that you've basically answered the question.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I would say, do you maybe want to react to this sort of idea of a counter space or counter community, or maybe the historical implication that comes with that, having to create these separate spaces when it comes to a society might um, that might be restrictive in a sense.
Yeah. Separate spaces. I mean, the separate space we see is in the bonds among the women, right? So that I think is very familiar to just, I think, uh, I'm not going to say oppressed people, but we can use that, right? In different contexts, we have oppressed people, different categories. And part of survival on the planet really just involves creating parallel spaces from the dominant society for yourselves, right? So, whether this is, women in a patriarchal society, it could be, let's say Black people in a white supremacist society. It could be like queer people in a hetero patriarchal society. So there are always the need, and there's that familiarity. I think that familiarity of the necessity of having a parallel space within a larger structure as a tool for survival, right? um, and I love how we see that. It keeps there's the when I think of the title of the film, on the sacred bonds, it's who is the sacred bonds actually between. Fanta, the sister, is the one who invokes it. She's like,
Mm,
"What about our sacred bond?" But I feel like there are so many threads to this sacred bond,
yeah.
and those threads are like woven together this parallel society of largely women. Also, the male doctor, but largely women kind of supporting each other
Yeah.
just to get through, you know. Um,
I'm agreeing with everything you're saying.
Yeah, I thought it was a really remarkable film, um, and I feel like the character of Ibrahim was he's a familiar character because I feel like I've seen that actor somewhere before, and so I had like a tender feeling towards his face, but he's so smarmy, he's so vile, you know. Um, Amina takes up violence at the end, but he's an actual violator. Like he violated her daughter. He violated someone who was a daughter to him, someone who he proposed to be a father to, right? Like his neighbor, this child who grew up in his neighborhood.
Mhm.
So, there are these multiple like competing forms of violence happening in this little quartier, and it was jarring to associate that character, that face, with such violation. Um, but I guess that is a credit to how well he played the role.
I think also the betrayal is so much more violent when you look at this idea of the film as looking at all these different bonds and the idea of Lingui and the neighbors. That's supposed to be a sacred bond.
Absolutely.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
in Chadian tradition, um, when you go to heaven, at least certain religions, the first thing that you're asked is how are your neighbors,
Hmm.
and this person that's supposed to be so close to the family and someone that might protect them, look out for them, breaking that bond is it makes it so much worse. And yes, and the actor played it in a way that was quite chilling, I will say.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, in Islam, the neighbor has the right over you. So his responsibility was to be have a protective role, and he betrayed that on so many levels. Yeah.
I think one of the other things that we could touch on and that was very striking in the film for me was the colonial remnants that exist. So this is a film that's set in Chad in the 2020s, and I think a way that it was expressed very clearly was the use of language and specifically switching languages. So you have Chadian Arabic, and then you also have French. And so while it's not systematic, uh, French is used in a more institutional sense, and also when it comes to the medical space. Um, so maybe I wanted to ask you, maybe I was the first, what you thought of this idea of using language as a form of power, and also what that says really about access, about societal control, and also access to care for women, especially African women in post-colonial Africa.
Oh,
That's a bit of a long question, I will say. Yeah,
yeah.
maybe heavy.
Um, how does language affect access to care? I mean, I think you're right that if you're going into kind of biomedical spaces where the forms of medicine are based on kind of Western science and training, then you're going to have to speak the language of that space. And so the thing is that colonial education and its derivatives, Western style education, we call them now, have been fairly thoroughly embedded in a lot of societies. So you still have people who maybe don't speak whatever uh, the lingua franca is, if it's French or English or Arabic or whatever. But I think that the vast majority of people in most African countries have some facility with whatever the colonial language was, right?
Mm.
Enough to be able to get help with it. So, I think that another way to think about it, I mean, the fact that there's Chadi and Arabic, there's um, there's indigenization of these languages that arrived to these African societies through various histories of violence. Um, and and there have been longstanding debates among African thinkers and writers about the extent to which they can own these languages, as opposed to continually experiencing them um, as acting upon them, right, and in a repressive way. Um, so I think it's a complicated question for that reason, right? There's some presumptions, but they're complicated by the debates around language now.
Yeah. I was also thinking maybe about the space of the school and the idea that you can't be a student and a mother all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. The space of the school as a kind of as in the legacy and the tradition of a colonial or a Western style idea of education, right? And in that space, there is a idea of the student. There's a normative idea of the student. You can't be above a certain age. You can't be pregnant, for example. You can't, there are all these associations with the idea of a student, and so you come into this space. There are already kind of forms of conformity that you have to like inhabit, embody in order to even participate in this space. So definitely the school is a disciplining space, and this is what we know about schools. This is what we experience here.
Mm.
It is a intensely disciplining space. And you see that also in the film. And I think it's interesting that this is a gendered way,
Mm.
right? It disciplines even the body. Like you can't show up with a pregnant body and be in the school. It doesn't look good for the school, as the principal said.
Okay, so before we open up the discussion to the audience, I wanted to ask if you had any more thoughts on the film or pressing issues or things that you need to get out right now. Maybe new thoughts as well, because we had a conversation about the film last week, but we rewatched it. So,
Yes, I had all these thoughts going through my head as I was rewatching it, and initially, what struck me was like the kind of the very kind of switching between languages, the just looking at Amina as such a strong mother woman, and this time the PTSD symptoms just like were just in my face, and I think because I knew that this was as a result of rape, this was as a result of trauma, and so the not wanting to be touched, the nightmares, the um, wanting to the suicide attempt. So there's a lot of these different elements that I was seeing this time around that were very stark symptoms of incredible amounts of distress that this young girl was experiencing. And it's earlier today I was in a discussion around how we can help refugee mothers, in particular in the context of Ukraine and Ukrainian mothers. And what was really interesting is that the first line of support for these mothers was the midwife. And that when these women did not want to see a psychologist or mental health professional, they wanted to see, they first wanted to be checked out by a midwife. And I thought, wow, this is so interesting that in this context, she didn't tell her mother, she didn't tell anybody, she told this midwife and disclosed to her who, what happened to her, who did it. And so, it just shows you the power of disclosure and who to disclose, to whom one would disclose. And generally, it's not a psychologist, firsthand, it's usually someone else. And so, a lot of the work that we do within the perinatal psychology world is train others to be able to detect what's going on for our patients, and then they get referred to us because we're not on the front lines. And especially in communities where mental health is very highly stigmatized, we definitely want you know everyone to be aware so that we get our patients, they get the patients to us. um, but I thought that was very, just a very interesting moment where when she disclosed that to the midwife. Yeah. So that's what I was thinking. So I'm glad we had an opportunity to discuss.
all right, thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay, we have two already.
This may be really stupid, but
Yes. Yes. That's why it was so gross, because yeah, it made it worse because the neighbor, he's a business owner. Yeah. Yeah.
Anything about white hair? I was wondering sorry, English is my second language. I'm French, or French born. I was wondering the last scene about all the women who cheer. Is it because socially it's the thing that they should do? Is it because they know there will be money? Because I cannot fathom that they actually support this genital mutilation.
Well, I mean, I think the fact that we can't fathom it doesn't mean that they don't support it, right?
Mhm.
What they support is this coming of age ceremony, right? That this is a ceremony that people go through, that one looks forward to, that parents sponsor, and this girl is going through the ceremony. So it's just a celebration of this coming of age ceremony. I think that um, what's interesting about this scene is that you see both things happening, right? There's like the celebration of the coming of age, and then there's also like the solidarity with the girl's body itself, right? Like the two things can happen together. And I also thought it was an interesting way to, I think in the West, there's a lot of um, just like fixation on, the cutting of the body and the imperative to save African girls, and in this scene, like they're saving themselves. They, like they've devised these, I think that it would be difficult for someone who was not from the culture to imagine that there are any strategies around um, going through this coming of age ceremony without traumatizing the body, right? Um, for many reasons, like literally what they're doing is unintelligible,
Mhm.
right? It's difficult to fathom, right? That it would happen, but also that there would be like strategies around it. So I thought it was a really beautiful like way of showing how they're solving their own, how they're dealing with their own issues.
Yeah, I was thinking the same kind of thing. Like it's something that you have to understand from the cultural standpoint and what is valued and what is important within the culture. And so it's this, coming of age is a big deal, right? And so, but there's also kind of that juxtaposition with being able to celebrate and protect. And so I think this is a question that I often get, like when I talk about like Muslim women's well-being and mental health, and we talk about rules around menstruation and postnatal bleeding, and sometimes usually someone comes up and says that's unfair, and I'm like, according to who? Who is it unfair according to you? Because for us as Muslim women, we have, there's an acceptance and an understanding and a value and a blessing and a beauty around accepting certain types of religious rulings that pertain to us. This is nothing has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with culture, and it has to do with tradition and what's important, for the context of their society. But I think, we have to also be very mindful about, well, I don't understand this. That's great. We can certainly help you understand, but not as a way of looking at it as 100% as being negative, which I think tends to be, I don't know the word. Yeah. Yeah. I think female circumcision is a negative thing. Sorry. But I no, I lost. I was thinking that the movie was the mother starts out. She goes to the services, the religious services. She listens to the um, I don't know the name of the priest who is the authority figure. And when she finds out her daughter is pregnant, she says,
you can't have an abortion, it's against Islam. So a lot of the movie is her changing her traditional thoughts to help her daughter.
No, I don't think she is.
That's how I see it. And
Okay.
and it's a bit of a feminist. It's a feminist movie because the patriarchal figure, which is that priest
Imam.
who comes, what?
The Imam.
Imam, who comes and says, you must cover your head, have to come to the services and we will help you, we will tell you what to do. She doesn't do that anymore. And the father figure who wants his daughter circumcised, and the community that goes along with it, it's a partial, in other words, it's showing change, but it's not a total change because the rest of society is still, they are more rebellious. They find other ways to deal with things, but it's not changing everybody's mindset in the society.
Right. I think that's so interesting. I think that there's that's a really great way of like interesting way of framing it, because it's like then the question that it raises for me is, is it possible for Amina to go in this like feminist, self-authorizing direction and also to retain her spirituality, right? Like is that, does that have, is it like a conflict for her, a choice for her, or is she able to do both? Like, is it possible for Fanta and Amina to do these things for their daughters that maybe others would frown upon in the society, and still they are part of the society and still remain within the society, right? So, that's not, so I think that the film does a really good job of showing how people kind of navigate the seeming binary of those choices. Like you can be your own person and still be part of your community, and I thought that was really interesting how they did that.
We have a question over there.
So I guess I'll probably ask like a follow up to what you just said. So do you think the film is like kind of like advocating for, or like advocating against the presence of like feminism in the Muslim community? Like the presence of like feminism in the Muslim community. Do you think like the film is kind of like pro or like against like those feminist
I don't think
choices?
there's a pro or against. I think the issue is that there's the way in which the thing about the way that I think Amina is being seen is black and white. And the thing is that she's not black and white. She's very complex. And the thing that I realized watching it a second time is that so the reason that she and the imam have the type of relationship that they do is she's likely part of a tariqa, like a Sufi group. And so he is her caretaker because she's part of this group. And so she is going to the mosque and praying. Women don't typically go to the mosque and pray. I'm sorry, like, is what I'm saying, like, it just seems like anything I'm saying to you is a bit of a shock. Okay. So I think, I wouldn't say it is and I wouldn't say it isn't a feminist, but I do a feminist portrayal, whether it's in Islam, it's like good or bad. But I think, Islam has a lot of feminism within it. And I think a lot of the perceptions of what feminism is needs to be kind of thought about, because she is someone who is going to the mosque because her imam has told her, hey, in order for you to be a Muslim that's on track, these are the things you need to do. And this is something that every Muslim who is doing, is on a path, they call it, a path of tasawwuf or Sufism. There is kind of, you're told, like, it's his job to come into her space and say, hey, what's going on? You're not behaving like you typically do. And so we can see that as like the man's telling her what to do, Or we could look at it from a cultural religious perspective and say, well, she's part of this group where she is, he's obligated to check on her. So I do think that there's elements of feminism for sure that are rooted in Islam, and there's elements that I don't think are as clear if you don't have familiarity with Islam. But I mean, I don't, yeah, like I said, I don't think it's, very kind of specifically kind of explicit in the film. Yeah.
Was there another question or remark over there?
Thank you both for your commentary. I'm wondering if there's room to complicate some of the kind of monolithic imagery and associations that we make with things like motherhood, for instance, right? Motherhood can certainly be about caring and taking care of, but motherhood will also, as Amina experienced, turn you out to live on your own. And I think that part of what was really interesting about the film for me was that there was a lot of playing with perceptions and kind of stereotypes or archetypes of what a thing means. What does it mean to be a family? What does it mean to be part of a religion? What does it mean to be part of a particular community? And so, could you talk a bit more about the ways that you saw some subversive elements in how the film portrayed these things that we tend to think of in really black and white ways that are never black and white?
I mean, the most subversive thing the thing that immediately comes to mind is her ambush of um, Brahim. Yeah, I think that was quite subversive, um, because he's a man, he's an older man, there are all these multi-layered uh, uh, social hierarchies that are being like subverted in that taking him down. She literally takes him down, right? So that was one scene that I thought was subversive, to show that, right? To show her capacity to take him down. Um, but I mean, I have to think a little bit about what you're saying about these archetypes of the mother. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I suppose there's the unseen mother, as you said, which is Amina's own mother, right? Like, why is Amina living alone in the city with her teenage daughter and no family? You know, why didn't, if her father was the one who pushed her out of the house, why didn't her mother step in like a lion to protect her, right? Um, so maybe there's those unseen mothers, and I appreciate your kind of um, seeing the those background characters too in the story. Why is Amina here, on her own? Why does she have to work so hard taking apart tires to create stoves to sell all day in the city, competing with people who will undercut her at the first chance, in order to live and to take care of her daughter? Why? Why is life so hard?
We have time for maybe a last question. Someone wanted? Yes, we have a question there. I think the mic is better if. Yeah, thanks.
Um, yeah, this is sort of a half-baked question inquiry, I suppose, but I'm really curious to hear both of your perspectives on the cultural significance of pregnancy and how women are viewed when pregnant, when they all become pregnant. And it's a very binary way of speaking it in terms of like women, but this movie is very gendered in a lot of ways. And to send them at that aside. topic I don't need to get into. But in terms of even like my own experiences where pregnancy is pushed, a lot of people can be disgusted by the pregnant body. And so I'm curious to hear about both of your insight in this specific instance, how pregnancy is viewed within a society.
So if we think, if you know, if it's within like the context of a heterosexual marriage, then it's seen as a very positive, beautiful thing, and the women are expected to experience it as very positive and beautiful and the most exciting time of their lives. But as a perinatal psychologist, we know that's even within that context, it's not always the case. If it's a planned pregnancy or unplanned pregnancy, if it's wanted or unwanted, all of these, issues will impact how somebody sees pregnancy. But within, the context of, a traditional society like this, pregnancy is supposed to happen within a particular context. And so that's going to influence the type of experience the person's going to have, the type of care they're going to get, the type of prenatal care or family support. What's really embedded within family support is like caretaking throughout the pregnancy, and then there's whole set slew of foods and caretaking that occurs after the pregnancy, after birth, to promote breastfeeding and all of these different things. So there's really I think it has to be within a context. And so one of the things we've seen in the literature is that, when the pregnancy is unplanned or unwanted, there's a higher chance of developing mental health concerns and also having, other, people have very different relationships with their bodies. Some of my patients who have like trauma histories, there's actually a fear of like, what happens when the baby starts to move? What happens when I start experiencing, quickening and kind of shifts? So it really depends person by person, but the expectation is that if it's within a particular context, that you see it as being, a positive, exciting time, and always to be smiling, and even if you feel miserable. It does. I think again, I think there's a separation that has to happen between culture and religion, because the thing is that the context of what most folks will kind of emphasize is kind of the cultural piece, the patriarchal piece, whereas like within Islam, there's a lot more flexibility than people think, and so we generally, when my Muslim patients come to me, we make sure that they know that you don't have to love being pregnant. You don't have to be walking around saying that this is the best thing that ever happened to you. But, there has to be the responsibility that a mother has towards the child is to make sure it's fed, but she doesn't have to feed the baby. She can have somebody else do it. She has the responsibility of making sure the child is clean, but she doesn't have to do that, right? So she's responsible for that, but Islamically, she's not the one who has to do that. But in society, right, like you're the mother, you have to do this, you have to do that, but that's largely, that's largely a societal expectation that we have of mothers.
Yeah, I think that said quite a lot. All I was going to say, which you already did, was that in the film, at least, Maria, she's maybe getting disgusted with her own body. And then we keep seeing her attempts to abort being foiled one way or the other.
Yeah.
And you're worried that she's actually going to have to go through with this pregnancy and her body's going to change and she's going to be trapped in it, And so, you were talking about people's relationships with their own bodies. I think that's also part of it. It's not just about the disgust from the gaze towards the pregnant body, but you're inhabiting the body.
Yeah, and there's also a regression that happens with Maria, like early, where she's like hugging her like little her plushy plush toy, and here she is like pregnant, but also wanting to be babied, kind of in this fetal position. So yeah, it's interesting.
Thanks for that question.
Well, thank you very much to everyone that came. Thank you to Venus. Thank you to Abosede. And there's one screening left for the Cinema Care Film Festival, so it's the final one. It's gonna be next. There's two. Oh yeah, actually, Notre Corps by Claire Simon. We couldn't show it last week because of restrictions on campus, so we're actually going to be showing it on November 21st. And next week we will be showing Madame Othman, which is a documentary about a nurse from France, and she's actually coming. So I would really encourage you to come to ask her your questions. So yeah, very exciting stuff coming. Check out the website for the Maison Française for our next events. And yeah, thank you very much. Have a good evening.